Good evening. My name is Mei Lee Tom. Welcome to the Leominster Public Library. Tonight's program is the Chinese Americans, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the ongoing question of who gets to be an American. We'd like to thank the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities for making this program possible, and for Ron Gerard from Leominster Access Television. Before we get started, we ask that you silence your cell phones if you haven't already done that. Restrooms are located through the back door. And if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibit, Chinese and the Iron Road, it is located on the second floor, and it's organized by the Chinese Historical Society of America and the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project at Stanford University. The exhibit pays tribute to the Chinese workers who helped build the nation's first transcontinental railroad from 1865 to 1869. It features historical and contemporary photos. Come on in. Illustrations and personal stories from descendants. It will be on display through July 10th. There's also a book display in the Carnegie Building. This week's program wraps up the Chinese and Iron Road series. If you missed the previous events, they can be viewed on Leominster Access Television Media on Demand. You will find the links on our library's website. So when you came in, you see the evaluation forms on the chair. Please take a few minutes after the program to complete the evaluation forms and leave them on the counter in the back of the room. Your comments are important as we review and plan for future programs. Our speaker is Dr. Ben Railton. He is Associate Professor of English Studies and American Studies at Fitchburg State University. His newest book, We the People, The 500-Year Battle Over Who is an American, will be released in August as part of Railton and Littlefield's American Ways series. Much of his published work dovetails with the Chinese and Iron Road project's broader frames and questions. Tonight's presentation will explore what a multi-generational, deeply rooted and evolving Chinese American community encountered in the 19th century and discuss what is unique about those historical and cultural issues and what in them resonates with broader American stories and histories. Many face brutal violence, prejudicial fears, and the nation's first immigration laws. Please welcome Dr. Ben Railton.
So I wanted to start with a couple of quotes from a particular late 19th century figure, John Marshall Harlan, who was a Supreme Court Justice, prominent Supreme Court Justice in the late 19th century. Harlan is generally remembered, and rightly remembered in a lot of ways, as a very impressive and inspiring late 19th century figure. He was a Civil War veteran who became a really prominent political and legal activist during Reconstruction, and after Reconstruction, eventually nominated to the Supreme Court. And on the Supreme Court, he's also best known for a particularly inspiring moment, which is his sole dissent to the Plessy v. Ferguson decision in 1896, the Supreme Court decision that ruled that racial segregation was constitutional. Harlan was the one dissenting voice, writing a really stirring dissent in opposition to that ruling, in opposition to that idea. But as with any historical figure, he's complicated, and certainly when it comes to Chinese Americans, much less impressive and inspiring, including in that dissent. And so the first of my two quotes is from that same dissent in 1896's Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, where he so inspiringly argued for African American rights under the law. He expressly contrasted African Americans with Chinese Americans, writing in his dissent that the Chinese are, quote, a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. And then a couple years later, he made that view even clearer in 1898 as part of a public lecture that he delivered, where he argued that the Chinese Americans, this is a race utterly foreign to us and one that never will assimilate with us. And if you think about those two quotes, and if you think about if you had a chance to hear the prior talks in this series, particularly the last two of the three that have come before, there are lots of ways you could read these in relationship to the points that those folks were highlighting, just to be clear. So Richard Chu, for example, talked about kind of myths and fears of Chinese arrivals, Chinese communities and immigrants in various ways, and certainly those myths, those fears, play into some of the ideas behind what Harlan is arguing about that race, that foreign other. Similarly, last week, Carolyn Yang, if you were able to be at that talk, addressed the idea of how the Chinese American community was affected by what she called the afterlife of slavery, shifting ideas of African Americans, and how that at the same time contributed to evolving ideas and more negative ideas, in that case about Chinese Americans. And you can obviously see that here, particularly as Harlan contrasts African American rights that he's arguing for in the Plessy dissent with Chinese American histories. So both of those prior talks would have those particular ways of reading these quotes. And obviously I think the whole point of this series is additive, right? Is adding these different readings and these different histories in. So those would be well worth remembering. And again, if you didn't get to hear them or see them yet, they're available online, or in Yang's case, soon will be. But I would emphasize something different in these quotes and then use it as a way into thinking about the bigger idea that I'm going to focus on and argue for in this talk tonight. I would emphasize the first-person plural pronouns that Harlan uses, the our and the us in these two quotes. A race so different from our own, and then again, I cut out the second we, but we do not permit, he says in that first quote. And then in the second quote, utterly foreign to us, never will assimilate with us. On one level, you can obviously see those first-person plural pronouns refer to a kind of white or European American identity. But I would say that that's not the only thing that the only work that he wants that pronoun to do, those pronouns to do. I think they very much at the same time refer to Americans, a definition of American, a vision of an American us. And I think, in fact, both the slippage between the kind of difficulty really parsing out whether he means white or European Americans and Americans, and then the relationship between those things is precisely his point, right? I mean, think about the last part of the last quote, never will assimilate with us. Again, you could partly read that as meaning alongside European Americans or white Americans. But that's not what the sort of language of assimilation usually refers to, right? It refers to assimilating into a society, into a whole community, a whole culture. So I think clearly that us is also doing the work of America, an American community, an American society. And so I think in these quotes, Harlan is arguing not only for an overtly sort of white supremacist or European American view of us, but at the same time for a definition of America that is linked to that us and that is inseparable from that same us. And that idea is one half of the battle that I highlight in the forthcoming book that Tom Bailey mentioned, that now has this beautiful cover from Rowman and Littlefield's American Ways series. It actually got pushed up. It's now July 15th, so coming out very soon, a couple weeks, is this book that argues for this idea of a battle over two definitions, two different visions of American identity, two defining ideas of America. One of which is what I call exclusion, or exclusionary ideas. And that's an attempt to define an us, to define an American we, in large part by identifying various thems, various other cultures or communities who are not centrally part of that we. And that definition isn't just about, say, foreign countries, which of course are not part of one nation in the same way, but it's often, if not always, about cultures and communities that are present in this place, in this setting, but not part of that definition, at least not in a central way. So when I think about exclusion, that's how I think about it. A definition of America that does identify certain aspects of that we, but often, and really centrally does it by also identifying thems that are excluded, at least from the sort of core, the essence of that definition. And again, I think you can see Harlan doing that really overtly in creating those images of that Chinese race, that Chinese American community that are utterly foreign to us, as he put it in that second quote, excluded linguistically, syntactically, and conceptually excluded from that we, from that us. The other side of this, well, seen through that lens, first of all, just say a little bit more about that exclusionary us. Those exclusionary definitions, first of all, you can trace across all the centuries of American history and pinpoint sort of different applications of it, different moments of it. That's what I try to do in part across the 8 main chapters of this book. Whether that's indigenous peoples defined as foreign to a kind of future America by the very first European arrivals, African American slaves defined as foreign to a revolutionary American project in the Revolutionary era, or all sorts of different Immigrant communities, or seemingly immigrant communities, I often argue for their presence already in America, as I will of Chinese Americans in a few. But across, again, multiple decades and multiple centuries, whether it's Papists and Irish Americans in the early 19th century, obviously Chinese Americans, as we'll get to, or many, many other immigrant communities down to our present moment in some very overt and definite ways. So this exclusionary idea echoes across our history in lots of different moments and with lots of different communities in mind. And seen through that lens, in the 19th century, Chinese Americans were one of the most consistent targets of that exclusionary idea, identified by that exclusionary idea as Harlan put it, outside of that us, foreign to that us, unable to become part of that American us. And that had a lot of different effects throughout the 19th century. It certainly coalesced into a particular narrative, which I think Richard Chu talked about at least a little bit, came to be called the Yellow Peril, this set of kind of cultural fears of various threats posed by these Chinese Americans and Chinese communities. The hard-to-read caption of this political cartoon is the Yellow Terror in all his glory. Yellow Terror was another kind of synonym for the Yellow Peril. And a lot of the fears encapsulated in that are captured in this one cartoon: violence, destruction, drugs, and vice. I think that's supposed to be a sort of opium smoke that he's got there. The threat to European American women, all posed by this, again, very distinctly foreign, depicted other to those exclusionary ideas of America. So this is a set of cultural fears that capture that set of exclusionary narratives. But there's lots of other places where that shows up in the 19th century as well. Politics becomes a central means for expressing those exclusions and arguing for them. This is the campaign ad for a California political party, a candidate for the California State Senate in the 1870s on a kind of small regional party known as the Workingmen's Party of California, with the overt slogan, "The Chinese must go," as the sort of overt message of this ad and this political party, and the boot of the Workingmen's Party there again, kicking this very stereotypically depicted Chinese American worker back on those steamships across the Pacific to China. So cultural fears, political narratives, definitely very real violence targeting Chinese American communities. Individuals, for sure. There were a set of lynchings across the West and Northwest targeting Chinese American individuals and groups of workers at times, but also even larger scale acts of violence, with this as one of a number of examples in the late 19th century, the so-called Chinatown War in Los Angeles in the early 1870s, or more accurately, as this historian's subtitle puts it, the massacre of that Chinese American neighborhood and community in Los Angeles in the early 1870s. Similar events happened in Seattle, in Tacoma, Washington, and a couple other large communities in the late 19th century. So cultural fears, political narratives, certainly actual violence. But the most overt place, and in some ways the most important for historical legacies place, where that exclusionary narrative toward Chinese Americans, that exclusionary vision of an America of which they are not a part, was developed and deployed in the late 19th century, was in a series of laws. And a series of laws that sort of are all in one way or another are related to the Chinese Exclusion Act, part of my title tonight, the 1882 law, but both preceding and following up that really central law. And elsewhere in a book called the Chinese Exclusion Act, I've argued for the sides of that law that have to do with the development of immigration law, which is one really important thread beyond or outside of the scope tonight. That is the first national immigration law of any kind. The Page Act of 1875 is a sort of minor one that I'll talk a little bit about in a second, but really the Chinese Exclusion Act is the first truly national immigration law, but one that only affects this one community, as Bailey mentioned, and as I'll come back to in a second. And then all the aftermath laws also represent the first development of immigration law in the US through this very particular lens of this attempt to exclude and discriminate that I'll say more about. And so there's a side of this whole slide that is about the development of immigration law in the US and how that happens in the late 19th century and what the legacies and the stakes of that are. But at the same time, and even more importantly for what I'm arguing tonight, these laws, particularly the ones beginning with the Page Act, reflect a really overt legal attempt to define this existing, long-standing American community as outside of America. And not only for future arrivals or new arrivals, but for existing Chinese Americans as well. And that's what I really want to emphasize in talking a little bit more about these laws before I turn to the other side of this coin, the inclusive alternative way of thinking about Chinese Americans. So just to say a little bit more about what I mean by that. The Anti-Coolie Act of 1862 is somewhat of an outlier. That was an act that was explicitly an attempt, at least in name and in practice in a lot of ways too, to stop a forced labor trade. Coolie was the term of the era for a kind of, not slave labor exactly, but certainly forced labor, kidnapped labor of Chinese workers brought to the Americas. Not so much to the United States. I think Richard Chu talked a lot about how that wasn't so much the case with Chinese American workers in the US as far as any historians have been able to tell. But in other places, Panama and Cuba, for example, both had pretty sizable versions of that forced labor trade. And so the Anti-Coolie Act passed during the Civil War, a war that was overtly being fought over the question of slave labor as well, was in part anyway, a genuine attempt by the US Congress to stop, or at least to not make part of the United States, that forced labor, that kidnapped labor of Chinese workers. On the other hand, the debate over it in Congress certainly reflected some of these exclusionary fears, the yellow peril fears, the narratives of Chinese workers or arrivals and some of the threats that they posed. But that's a bit of an outlier. It's really beginning with the Page Act that you see this attempt to define legally the Chinese American community as outside of the US. And again, not only in terms of new arrivals, but also and most importantly in terms of destroying or limiting an existing Chinese American community. And the Page Act does that in one very specific way, which is it attempts to make it illegal for Chinese women to immigrate or be in the United States. And again, it overtly refers to new arrivals, but very much in practice was an attempt to affect existing Chinese American communities and Chinese American women already in the US. And the way that it did that was by defining Chinese American women as prostitutes under the language of the law. That's the overt language of the Page Act, is that Chinese American women who are coming to the United States are coming in immoral and lewd roles, and they need to be kept out or forced out of the United States as a result of that role. And so beginning even with that very first law, you've got not only an image of new arrivals, but an image of an existing set of Chinese American communities through a very particular lens that is overtly defined as illegal, overtly defined as in need of exclusion for moral and ethical reasons as well as legal reasons. And that then is expanded by the next three laws that develop, the Chinese Exclusion Act and its two aftermaths, the Scott Act and the Geary Act. Again, in some ways these are overtly about limiting future arrivals and future immigration. And that certainly was a key piece of all of these laws, and a key goal of them was to make it difficult, if not impossible, for Chinese Americans to arrive. But the Chinese American community by 1880 was already a sizable one. The 1880 census has 102,000 documented Chinese Americans on that 1880 census, which is the first to ask about ethnicity and nationality as part of the census in that particular way. In all likelihood, there were many more than that. In 1880, it was very difficult for that census to accurately gauge communities such as mining or railroad camps that we've talked a lot about in this series, or other kind of crowded communities. But even in that documented way, 102,000 Chinese Americans in 1880, a significant number. And so this wasn't just a group of new arrivals, this was a well-developed, long-standing population, as I'll keep thinking about in a second. And the Exclusion Act dealt with that population in very explicitly exclusionary ways. The most overt was the stripping of citizenship from any Chinese American who had been able to gain citizenship, which some significant number had. And citizenship at this point was still very much done state to state in a lot of cases, at least up until the 1870 Naturalization Act, which was kind of the first shift into a more national naturalization and citizenship policy. And as a result, a number of Chinese Americans had become US citizens in various states, including somebody, Young Wing, who we'll talk about in a few minutes. And the Exclusion Act stripped that citizenship of any who had already gained citizenship, as well as making it impossible to give it. So if you think about the Harlan quote where he said, "This is why we don't give citizenship to Chinese Americans," in that first quote in Plessy. In fact, we have routinely, and that had been a shift occasioned by the same kind of fears that Harlan was expressing, but not what we had always done. Instead, very overtly part of these exclusionary shifts, not that long at all before Harlan is writing his dissent. And then the Scott Act and the Geary Act go further still in attempting to define that Chinese American community as outside of a broader American community in very overt ways. So the Scott Act, for example, makes it illegal for any Chinese American already in the United States to leave the country and then attempt to come back. So that's a provision of that law that has nothing to do with new arrivals. In fact, it overtly does the opposite. It overtly attempts to make existing Chinese Americans and Chinese American communities make it particularly difficult for them to continue existing. Richard, you talked a lot about the idea of sojourners, immigrants who move back and forth. And I would push a little bit further on what he was arguing and say, I think the idea that those are two separate categories, sojourners and immigrants, is one way of thinking about it, but it's not the way that I would argue it. I think almost always multi-generational immigrant American communities have movement, right? Movement back and forth, movement back to other countries, to other places, and then back to the United States again. That's a really common, if not, in fact, shared phenomenon of all multi-generational American communities throughout our history, and enduring one. I've seen it certainly in my own family background in multiple ways. And so to make that impossible, to make it impossible for individuals to leave and come back, could be framed as an attempt to limit that idea of sojourning. But it really isn't doing that, right? Because it's not simply saying can't come and then leave. It's saying can't be here, leave, and then return to the United States again. What that really is an attempt to do is an attempt to destroy the ability of a community to maintain those ties, to maintain those multi-generational connections that, again, are how any multi-generational immigrant American and American community has developed. And so I think that was really targeting not just the myth of the sojourner, although that may have been in there, but making it difficult for that community to continue to exist in the United States. That particular and very striking provision, not at all related to the idea of new arrivals, but again, quite the opposite, only affecting those who were already here. And the Geary Act goes a little bit further still. The Geary Act was overtly just an extension of the Exclusion Act. It was originally a 10-year exclusion when it was passed in 1882, so the Geary Act is what sort of made it more the permanent law of the land at that time, up until World War II at least, and after in some ways. But the Geary Act also contained other provisions, and another really striking one was the requirement that all Chinese Americans in the U.S. carry identification papers at all times, residency papers they were called at all times, making them the only community in the U.S. that was asked to do that, to carry these identifying papers or risk immediate deportation if they were ever apprehended for any reason, whatever those reasons might be, without their papers, again, irregardless of how long they may have been in the U.S., how much a multi-generational family or community was, without those kind of defining and distinguishing documents, which again applied to no other American community at the time, or after for a long, long time, that community could be immediately deported, any members of it. And so again, that's a provision that is entirely about trying to make life for members of that community already in the United States at least distinct from any other community, and I would argue certainly more arduous and dangerous and threatened at all times by the idea of deportation, again, regardless of an individual's status or identity. Even those who were born in the U.S., it's worth saying, I'm not going to talk at length about this, I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A if we want. The one victory, kind of legal victory for Chinese Americans in this series of laws, the first three Supreme Court cases there were cases that upheld aspects of the Chinese Exclusion Act as constitutional, and so were part of the development of these laws and exclusions. I put Wong Kim Ark versus the U.S. in brackets because it's the opposite. It's the one legal victory. Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States, in San Francisco. I'll talk a little more about him in a second. And he was detained upon trying to re-enter under the Scott Act, but argued that since he had been born in the United States, he was part of the idea of birthright citizenship that the 14th Amendment had enshrined in the United States Constitution, and was a United States citizen as a result. That case wound its way through the courts at length, eventually making it to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court did rule, in a kind of narrow ruling, but one that was a victory very much nonetheless, that Wong Kim Ark did have that birthright citizenship, was a U.S. citizen. But even Chinese American U.S. citizens born in the U.S. and thus not subject to all these other overt exclusions had to carry those residency papers at all times, or still risk the possibility of deportation because, of course, his status could be defined legally very differently at any moment. That was really what a lot of these laws highlighted, was how fragile even the most overt definitions or identities were. So I dwell on all that, I dwell on all those laws just to make really clear what I mean by exclusion. This isn't just about new arrivals, although it's often framed that way by the arguments for the laws. These are new communities, these are threatening communities, these are communities that represent a change in one way or another. And there may be elements of that. It's worth thinking about in any given moment how communities are changing. But at their core, I believe these exclusionary arguments are always targeting existing communities. And in fact, that's really the definition of them, is that they're trying to define an us that includes, literally includes, these cultures and communities, but that doesn't, in its ideas, in its definitions, include them. And the corollary of that is that an attempt to ultimately to force those individuals and communities out. That isn't always necessarily the result, but it's very frequently the result of those exclusionary definitions, is the follow-up of Indian removal, of the Filipino Repatriation Act, of all these moments when communities that are defined as outside the us are then pushed out of that shared community because of that definition. And that certainly is one central element of this development of these laws across the 1870s, 1880s, and into the early 20th century. So that's a bit about exclusion. And there's various ways then, for the latter part of this talk, that I want to try to push back on that and argue for the other side of that battle. If you remember the subtitle of my book, The 500-Year Battle Over Who is American, the battle that I'm arguing for is a battle between exclusion, on the one hand, with a lot of the things I've already tried to gesture out of it, and inclusion as the other idea at the other end of the spectrum. And by inclusion, I mean, again, not just the idea of welcoming new arrivals in that sort of Emma Lazarus Statue of Liberty way, although sure, but also, and even more fundamentally, defining an America that has always included these cultures and communities, of which they are already a part, and thinking then about how we define that we as featuring all these communities rather than as simply welcoming new ones. Although, of course, the corollary would be a continued amplification of that inclusive identity by continuing to welcome arrivals and communities. But an inclusive definition, as I want to think about it, is about recognizing that long-standing identity. And in fact, my argument is that the inclusive definition sees that there has never been an America without all these different communities and cultures. There is no place one can look that does not feature them. That's true in various ways and degrees with all the communities I look at. It's definitely true of Chinese Americans, and I highlight this picture of kids from sometime in the late 19th century in San Francisco's Chinatown, just to sort of visually represent that idea of a multi-generational community. Again, there are 100,000+ Chinese Americans on the 1880 census. That is a community that we know goes back at least to the beginning of the 19th century, on the west coast of what was then still part of Mexico, or Spain and then Mexico, long before there was the United States presence in places like California, and long before there were many Anglo-American residents. That really develops in a lot of ways in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, as we've heard a lot about from our earlier talks, through things like the gold rush and the railroad boom that a lot of these talks have focused on. And that then by the 1870s and 1880s has expanded on the West Coast, but also expanded throughout the country with the first development of Chinatowns in Boston and New York, with documented Chinese American communities in Mississippi and Louisiana, in many, many places around the country. So one way to push back on the exclusionary narrative, to argue for an inclusive way of thinking about Chinese Americans in an American identity, is simply to highlight, and not simply, it's crucially to highlight that long-standing multi-generational presence, which at the very least forces an argument about how the laws were an attempt to respond to that existing community, rather, again, simply new arrival. This was not a new community. It was a long-standing multi-generational one. That is an important history to remember and argue for, and one that there are lots of ways to do that with. But that's not enough. And the reason that's not enough, well, there are lots of reasons that that's not enough, but one of them is that the exclusionary narrative is frequently deployed against communities that are clearly already here, that there can be no argument we're not already here. Indigenous peoples are a great example, right? Even the most vehement anti-Native American racists couldn't possibly argue that those communities weren't present in the Americas, in the United States at every point. And similarly, of course, African American slaves have been a part of the 13 colonies since at least their earliest moments, those European American colonies, to name a couple examples. So it's not enough just to argue for presence, although that certainly is one way to push back on exclusionary visions of Chinese Americans. You also have to think about other ways of arguing for an inclusive vision of America that, again, includes and features a community like Chinese Americans rather than attempts to exclude them. Presence is one part, but it's not the only part, and it can't be the only one. But there are other ways. There are other levels to making the case, and I want to just highlight quickly a few different examples from the late 19th century of other kinds of stories and histories that are also ways to push back, ways to offer inclusive responses that are also, the other thing I'll just say about them, besides being histories that happened and are worth remembering, ways to make the case for an inclusive America that features these different Chinese American figures and stories. They're also really consistently inspiring. One reason why in the book, something like 3/4 of each of my chapters focus on the inclusive side, is that these are the histories that we want to remember in order to make the case for the best of who we are as Americans. I can't emphasize that enough, that the darkest histories, the most divisive ones are there, and you can't remember the best without remembering them too. That's certainly the case here. But you also can't remember the best at all if you don't think about these inclusive histories. That's absolutely my contention, and I think these individual cases bear it out. These are consistently some of the most inspiring, impressive figures and moments and histories and stories that we have in our collective history. And the more they're part of our collective memory, the more we can be inspired by them in the ways that we desperately, desperately need to. So just a few examples of that. The one I'm not going to dwell on at length, because we've already heard a lot about it really nicely across all these talks, is the overt focus of this talk, of this series. And I apologize for not talking too much myself about Chinese American railroad workers. I hope on the earlier talks, I know they've highlighted a lot of really great histories and stories and details of that community across the 19th century and through the lens of the Transcontinental Railroad. And again, those talks, if you didn't get to hear them, are on the site or soon will be on the library site linked through the Leominster Access TV site. They are well worth your time. And there's no doubt that that community is a crucial example of that, right? For reasons that somebody like Richard Chu laid out really beautifully. The Transcontinental Railroad is often highlighted as one of the 19th century's most significant and impressive American achievements of technology, of infrastructure, of transportation, of sort of collective will. And that story simply doesn't exist, doesn't happen without those Chinese American workers. Obviously there are tragic and destructive sides of that, and again, they're part of remembering it, but there also are deeply impressive and inspiring sides of that work, of that collective effort, of what that community contributed to something that fundamentally changed the United States and its identity and its the relationship of its different parts to each other. And even within that, we can see, again, exclusion versus inclusion, right? And Richard talked about this well, but I just want to reiterate it. In that formal photo, and this is a blurry version, but I'm sure you all have some experience with that photo, as he highlighted, there are no Chinese American workers in that famous photograph of Promontory Point and the celebration of the 1869 completion. There may be one whose face is covered, as he noted, but no visible Chinese American workers. So we have there a really overt act of exclusion, right, of exclusion of that community who had been such a central part of that moment, even literally at that exact moment of completion, and certainly for decades before, not being present in that way of framing the collective memory. And as a result of that, we do have the development over the last couple decades especially of inclusive alternatives. At the 150th conference, for example, this was a gathering, I believe, mostly of descendants of Chinese American railroad workers and other Chinese American community leaders. This is just from a great a news story from Utah about it. If you Google that Golden Spike Conference, you can learn a lot more about these individuals, this celebration, the way that this picture and this moment makes the case for that inclusive vision of remembering those workers, remembering that community as part of these celebrations, as part of the memorial, the commemoration, and as part of American history. So certainly that particular community, the focus of this exhibition and series, highlight the exclusionary side in part, but more importantly, both in the history and in the possible collective memories, the inclusive side, the way of remembering and featuring and celebrating that community and their contributions. So that's all one part of the histories. But I want to highlight a few others as well. The first are a couple other examples of legal inclusion, legal resistance and inclusion. Again, law was how the exclusionary narrative was most fully developed, as was often the case in American history, although not the only way, certainly violence and other things played into it. But law was also a space where inclusive alternatives and resistance could take place. I mentioned Wong Kim-ark already. He's a really good individual example of that, and not just individual. His successful case required work by multiple communities and organizations, both Chinese American and allies, to help bring that case to its successful completion and guarantee that not only Wong himself could stay in the United States, but that many other US-born Chinese Americans could have those same protections. That started almost right away when he was being detained on a ship in San Francisco Harbor. This was prior to the opening of the Angel Island Immigration Station / Detention Center in San Francisco Harbor that became the kind of focal point for the detention of those targeted by the exclusion era. Prior to that, people like Wong were simply detained on ships for sometimes months. He was detained for something like 6 months on ship in San Francisco Harbor while awaiting, again, the resolution of his attempt to re-enter the United States. He was born in the US in about 1870, had traveled to China to visit relatives, attempted to come back, was denied entrance for, again, that long period of time. And almost immediately, as his case gained some attention, he gained, again, the support and connection of various organizations, one in particular who represent this kind of inclusive alternative is a group called the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, CCBA, which is a kind of collection of community organizations in and around San Francisco's Chinatown, historical, deeply rooted, and then moving into more legal activism in the late 19th century in response to these laws. Well, with the help of those organizations and some of their legal allies, among other allies, again, Wong is able to bring his case forward. It goes through multiple levels, the California State Court, the Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court. But eventually, with the help of, again, those allies and organizations, successfully uses the law to argue for his American identity, for a fundamental inclusion of not only himself, but again, many, many others in an inclusive vision of American identity that includes the law, that in fact uses the law as often these inclusive arguments in support of it, rather than just as a means of exclusion. So he's a really prominent example of that. More complicated, I recognize, but also I think another really good example is the case of the so-called Paper Sons, who are Chinese-American arrivals who, in the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 and fire, the Great Fire that followed it, use the law in a very different way to make it possible for them to become part of the United States. You probably all have a sense of this phrase. The basic thing that happens is after the San Francisco earthquake and fire, many of the records in that city are destroyed. And so Chinese-American families who are already in the United States are able, at times, to successfully argue that new arrivals are part of their families, even if they are not biologically part of their families. A broader definition of the family, a broader vision of not only family, but community, that makes it possible for many new Chinese-Americans to arrive and become part of the U.S., even in an era when that, again, legally, under the Exclusion Act, is not possible. I think this is a really good example, not to get too deep into these weeds, but a really good example of how, if immigration law develops to exclude, which it does entirely, that means that the category of illegal immigrants is a category that is the first one constructed. And it's constructed entirely to exclude particular individuals, like these arrivals, right? There are no corresponding legal immigrants in that area. Anybody else who's immigrating has no law that they're subject to. They simply continue to come. The only immigrants who are defined by law are those who are defined as unable to come by law. And so this entire community, all these Paper Son arrivals are illegal immigrants. They are coming outside of the Exclusion Act and its aftermath laws. They are coming outside of the only immigration laws that exist in the era. And I would argue in a way that is an inspiring, inclusive example of how communities continue to develop despite those discriminations, despite those exclusions. But in any case, it's another example of using the language of the law, using the details of the law to argue for an inclusive community, one that redefines family even to include other Chinese-American arrivals in that aftermath of 1906. So certainly a more complicated one than Wong Kim Ark's case, but a really important example of using the law to make inclusion possible, both on the ground and in concept. Literature is another place where we can think about inclusion. I won't say too much about either of the examples I'll highlight. They're well worth your time beyond these couple minutes. One of which are the poems carved on the walls of Angel Island. I mentioned Angel Island already. It was that immigration station or detention center that opened in about 1910 in San Francisco Harbor and became the central location for the next few decades at least of the detention of not only Chinese American but many other Asian American arrivals as well. Soon after 1910, virtually every Asian nation was subject to its own version of exclusion. 1917, the Immigration Act created the Asiatic Barred Zone, which made it illegal for individuals from almost any Asian nation to immigrate to the U.S., other than the Philippines, which was a U.S. protectorate at the time. And so it's not just Chinese Americans who are detained at Angel Island, but certainly that's a sizable percentage throughout its history. And throughout its history, members of that community carved these poems onto the walls of their cells in that detention center. Many of them have survived in what is now a National Historic Site in San Francisco Harbor, and they reflect not only the multiple voices of this community, but really powerfully ideas of that community as a multi-generational, inclusive American community. So these are just two of the many poems. They're collected in various ways. There's a couple great websites. There's an anthology of them as well, all ways that you can get further into reading these, but these are just a couple examples that really highlight that multi-generational and multi-voice community. The first that reads, "There are tens of thousands of poems on these walls. They are all cries of suffering and sadness. The day I am rid of this prison and become successful, I must remember that this chapter once existed." So again, a communal experience, also a profoundly individual one, but also a vision not only of that present, but of a future that unfolds from that, right? And that features those voices and that community as part of that unfolding future, even though certainly the vision of it is a more optimistic one there. And the second is even a little bit more about that multi-generational and multi-vocal community in an optimistic way. This is a message to those who live here not to worry excessively. Instead, you must cast your idle worries to the flowing stream. Experiencing a little ordeal is not hardship. Napoleon was once a prisoner on an island, which is a really great use of history to make the case for a present and future perspective. And again, this is a poem that the audience is explicitly, I would say, future generations, right? Others who might occupy that same settle, might occupy that same space, go through that same experience and learn from this voice a different possibility, a different way of seeing a future in which they can move forward, just like the first poem argues for as well. So these poems really reflect not only that particular place and that really dark part of the exclusion era, but also this multivocal and again multi-generational Chinese American community writing to each other, writing out of that experience and imagining an America that they are a part of. In this moment, in writing these texts and certainly going forward, a more individual literary voice, again I won't say much about but is well worth your time, is Sui Sin Far. That was her published name, born Edith Maud Eaton. She was had a very complicated individual biography and career. She was the daughter of a Chinese woman brought back by missionaries to England and an English father. They immigrated to Canada, to Montreal, when she was very young, where she initially grew up, and then she spent most of her adult life in and around the United States, working as a journalist, eventually a creative writer. In her far too short life, just a couple years before she passed away, she published her first collection of fiction, Mrs. Spring Fragrance and Other Writings, which is a kind of short story cycle about the Chinese American experience under the exclusion era, although not limited to it. That just scratches the surface of her really impressive multicultural and multi-genre career and work as a writer. She has one story that really overtly reflects the exclusion era and its laws. It's called In the Land of the Free, and it's about a Chinese American family already living in the U.S. who suffer the same kind of effects that somebody like Wang Kimark suffered, in their case particularly for their young newborn really son, who was taken from them and held at a detention center for nearly a year in a situation that feels all too familiar in 2019, but is set around 1900 in that exclusion era. So that story, In the Land of the Free in particular, is a really powerful use of literature to represent some of those histories and their effects on individuals and families. But throughout her career in all sorts of different ways, as far as writing about those different sides of Chinese American community and envisioning them as very much a part of a late 19th and early 20th century America. So using literature to argue for inclusion in that way. But I want to end by saying, I did highlight just the name of that story, In the Land of the Free. It was originally published in 1909 in a newspaper called The Independent, or a magazine, and then again collected in that 1912 book on Mrs. Spring Fragrance. But I want to end by saying in a couple different ways why this particular set of histories, which some folks here have heard me talk about before, I've talked about them a lot. They're some of my favorite American histories, those connected to the Chinese educational mission of Hartford, Connecticut, and its founder, Young Wing, and the 120 students who came, Chinese young men who came to be part of that mission in the 1870s and early 1880s. That building, unfortunately, no longer survives in Hartford. That's a depiction of it in the 1870s when it was founded. There's not a lot of collective memory of it. This is one of these inclusive histories that we don't remember well, although that's a continued goal of mine, is to try to change that in this particular case as well as in a lot of these other cases. And it's a set of histories that both through Young and through the students, and then through one kind of very metaphorical, symbolic moment that I'll end with, again, reflect this idea of thinking about an inclusive America that features Chinese Americans in all these different multi-generational aspects of community. That's certainly true of Young himself. This is a depiction of him around the time when he founded the mission, or a little bit after. As an older man, he came to the U.S. originally at the age of about 20 in 1848. And then founded the school in 1872, so he has a long, multi-part Chinese American life already by the time that the school is successfully opened in the 1870s. And every part of that story, even prior to the school, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second, is an example of a kind of multi-generational, multi-stage Chinese American life that is inclusive in a variety of inspiring ways. This is a depiction of probably around the time again when Young comes to the U.S. at the age of 20, brought along with two other young men by missionaries to Connecticut. He's the only one of the three who ends up staying in the U.S. And again, at every part of his life, which is very much a Chinese American life, he moves back and forth as an adult very fully between the two nations until the aftermath of the exclusion era, as I'll briefly mention, and many different stages really embodies kind of different sides of an inclusive vision of American ideals that his life and experience connect to. So just to name three really quickly. His college experience, he ends up attending Yale, which was part of the goal when he comes to the United States. He first goes to preparatory school in Massachusetts. But the way he attends is overtly an example, I think, of a kind of inspiring vision of education and identity in America. When it comes time for him to matriculate at Yale, to start at Yale, the missionaries who had brought him renew their pledge to support his time at Yale, to help pay for it, but only if he promises to return to China after graduation to continue that missionary effort. That's not the future that Young necessarily envisions for himself. We know this in part from his own autobiography called My Life in China and America that he publishes in 1909, just a few years before he passes away, and it's available in full online, at least as of right now. He envisions a different possible future, and so he gratefully turns down that offer and finds other ways of financing and supporting his own college experience, partly through friends that he had made during his time in the United States, and partly by working throughout his time at Yale, which is one of the first examples that I know of a kind of work-study student and situation, financing his own education there, becoming the first Chinese-American college graduate that we know of, anyway, documented one in 1854 when he graduates Yale. Along the way, he also becomes a U.S. citizen in Connecticut, which made it possible for Chinese Americans, Asian Americans to become citizens under its laws, as I mentioned, it varies state to state. So that's one moment, an example. He volunteers for the the Union Army during the Civil War, and another really inspiring moment. He's, after graduation, again, he's moving back and forth as a kind of diplomat between the United States and China. But he's in the U.S. in 1864, right at some of the bloodiest fighting of the last couple of years of the Civil War. And while he's waiting on a sort of diplomatic mission that he's part of, he travels to D.C., meets with the general in charge of volunteers for the Union Army and volunteers. He's turned down, possibly out of sort of diplomatic courtesy, possibly out of early Yellow Peril fears, perhaps some combination of both. But in any case, that's certainly another moment of, as he puts it, his dedication to his adopted home, to his new country, and his desire to be part of even one of its darkest and most violent moments. During those same years, he also does really pioneering work as a journalist and activist opposed to that coolie trade that I had mentioned, particularly in Panama and Cuba. He argues successfully to the Viceroy of China for a commission to fight that kidnapping and that trade, and then personally oversees the investigations in Panama, even taking photographs at night of workers and their kind of injuries that he can use to document their situation, which he and a colleague in Cuba bring back to the Viceroy and successfully argue for the abolition of Chinese support and participation in any way in that trade in those nations. So a few different moments along the way that are really exemplary kind of visions of his Chinese-American, even hemispheric Chinese-American identity, and an inclusive vision of that community that he's part of. And then founding the school is another really explicit example of that. Along the way, he also, I should say, continues his own multi-generational Chinese-American story. That's his wife, Mary Kellogg, of Avon, Connecticut. They meet in the early 1870s and get married there in Connecticut in 1875. Have two sons who are here, Morrison and Bartlett Young, who are obviously the next stage in that multi-generational American story, Chinese-American family and story, and about whom a little bit more in a second. But at the same time that he's doing that, he also founds the school. Get to that kind of thing. And the school is a whole other set of histories that would need much more time than I'm going to give it here. 120 young Chinese-American men who were brought to the United States to have experiences very similar to Young's in a lot of ways, to attend preparatory schools throughout New England, to have the opportunity to attend college, the opportunity for military service, which has been a significant part of his own Chinese-American evolving story, both in China and certainly the potential in the U.S. as well, and many other sides of that educational missions goals for that group of students. All of whose identities, I'll talk about a couple in a second, are also documented online. There's a great project called CEM Connections, the Chinese Educational Mission Connections.org, where the descendants have documented the bios of all 120 pretty thoroughly already, and it's a continuing to evolve project. The school and Young suffer very fully as a result of the exclusion era. I'm not going to dwell on these because I want to talk about a couple of the continued inspiring and inclusive sides. But the school is closed in 1880, 1881, just before the Exclusion Act, but as a direct result of that era and its attitudes. The students who try to attend military academies are denied entrance even though they had been legally promised the opportunity to attend, and are denied solely because of their Chinese-American identity. That leads the Chinese government to withdraw its own support from the school. Among other factors, that leads the school to close, and many of the students are forced to leave the U.S., although not all, as I'll talk about. Young is also drastically affected in the aftermath of the Exclusion Act. His citizenship is stripped from him when he continues to travel, as he has to diplomatically for his continued role. Eventually, he is not allowed back in the United States later in the 1880s, even though he has a still young family. The stress of that entire period leads Mary, at least contributes to Mary passing away very young, and tragically in the 1880s, and Morrison and Bartlett are fostered out as teenagers to friends in New England, as Young is still legally not allowed back into the U.S. for the remainder of his life. He does, I believe, come back, and I'll say one thing about that in a second. But again, even the school is not just affected by that closure, or at least there are inclusive ways of thinking beyond that. I just want to highlight a couple of examples. One is even those individuals who do have to leave when the school is closed. This is one of them, Jeme Tianya. He is a student who was studying to be an engineer in the U.S. In college at the time of the school's closing. When he goes back to China, he continues that work. He becomes a really prominent engineer at the end of the 19th century in China, revolutionizing their naval system in particular. And then his sons return to the United States to attend college, his two sons in the early 20th century. Again, a complicated thing in the exclusion era, but one that they find a way to achieve, extending his and their multi-generational Chinese-American identity even after his own forced departure when the school closes. Some of the students do find ways to stay, and this is a particularly inspiring example. Cheng Hongyan, who was studying to be a lawyer when the school closes. He stays in the United States, tries to pass the bar exam in New York State after he graduates from Yale Law School, is not allowed to take the actual New York bar exam because of his Chinese-American identity, works with allies in New York to write a separate kind of parallel bar exam, gets that approved by the New York State Supreme Court, passes it, becomes a lawyer, travels to the west coast of the US, and then works for a number of those latter decades of his life on behalf of those Chinese-Americans detained in places like Angel Island in San Francisco. So an incredibly inspiring, multi-part Chinese-American story of one of the students who is able to stay. I think my last is the baseball team. So before I get to the baseball team, my final example, I will just say Young himself is a really inspiring possible example. Again, tragic in many ways, the aftermath of the Exclusion Act for Young and his family. But his final act, the final act of his life, I think reflects how that inclusive community continues to develop even despite those darkest sides, and just as the Paper Sons did in their own way. Again, officially he's not allowed back into the U.S., and officially the only time he comes back at all is in 1902 when he attends his younger son Bartlett's graduation of his own from Yale as a kind of diplomatic guest on the dais, and then officially would have been required to leave again and not legally allowed to stay in the U.S. But when Young dies in 1912, in his New York Times obituary, the obituary is dated from Hartford, Connecticut, and it begins that on so-and-so day, Young Wing died at his home in Hartford. And I read that, among other clues in his autobiography, as a case that he did find ways to stay. He did find ways to remain in the U.S. for much of that last decade with those sons, Morrison and Bartlett, who continued also to move back and forth. At the time of his death, as his obituary noted, Morrison was with him, and Bartlett was traveling in Hong Kong. So they continued that multi-generational Chinese-American story, just as I think Young's did up until his 1912 passing. But I want to end with this more metaphorical example of the Chinese educational mission baseball team. This is the first era of semi-pro baseball in the United States, the 1870s and 80s, also of college baseball, high school and college, and many of these young men play for their preparatory schools and for colleges like Yale. But then once they graduate, or along with those experiences, they also form a semi-pro team, which was, again, kind of the first era of these semi-pro leagues. There was a prominent New England League, and this team joins that prominent New England League. They were officially called the Orientals. They called themselves the Celestials, which I prefer as well. And the Celestials are a really successful team. They become really well-known in that semi-pro league. They even feature a star pitcher named Lefty, or nicknamed Lefty, just because it's a baseball story, and I believe that's a requirement. And even when the school closes, that story continues. This, first of all, is Lefty, Leominster, who, again, was a star pitcher for that team, had pitched, I believe, for Yale, and became a star of the Celestial team in that semi-pro league. And when the school is closed and most of the students are forced to travel by train to the Bay Area and await a steamship back to China, those who were forced out, like Jeme Tianya, who I talked about, and Liang Tunyan, most of the baseball team are likewise forced out, as you can see in their bios on that website I mentioned. But while they're waiting in San Francisco for that steamship, they're challenged to a baseball game by an Oakland team in a different semi-pro league. And it's uncertain exactly what that challenge represents. It's certainly possible to see it as good sportsmanship, an attempt to use sports to kind of bridge a gap like this, if only briefly. It obviously would be possible to see it as instead one more piece of an exclusionary kind of way of thinking, or of that era, one more chance to defeat this group of Chinese Americans before they are going to leave the United States. In any case, a student who becomes a kind of documenter of the experience, a guy named Wang Pincheng, who writes about it in a kind of a journal that he keeps, writes that he believed, or that the way he sees it is that the Oakland men imagined that they were going to have a walkover with the Chinese. That's how Wang at least framed that final game. But instead, the Celestials win that final game. There's a box score the next day in the San Francisco Chronicle on September 4th, 1881, that the Celestials win that final game 11-8. And then the next day, they're forced to leave the United States on that steamship that takes, again, the majority of those CEM students, including the majority of that baseball team, away from their adopted home of the U.S. And that steamship, that moment, certainly reflects a victory, a clear victory for exclusion, right? And exclusion, part of the argument of this book is not only that it's been present throughout American history at all these different moments and all these different contexts and cultural connections, but it has been a victorious argument a lot of the time. Much of American history reflects exclusion's successful attempts at least to target American communities and to drastically affect them, whether it's Young and his family or these individual students or the entire exclusion era for so many Chinese Americans living at least in that state of constant threat, if not overtly affected and destroyed in many ways beyond that. There's no way to tell the story of these histories without thinking about exclusion's continual presence and effects and victories a lot of the time. And that steamship is, in part, an example of that victory. But I would say a couple other things about inclusion in closing here and about Chinese Americans in particular. One is if we forget all these histories and all these stories and all these figures and communities, if we don't include them, then we're just furthering that work, right? We're just doing exclusion's work sort of one more time. And even more overtly because it wasn't the case, right? The community endured, these individuals existed, these stories continued as part of the U.S., outside of the U.S., back and forth between the U.S. and other places. All these stories continued, the community endured. And all these figures and families and communities endure. And if we don't remember them, again, it's simply furthering exclusion in our collective memories. And that's a place where inclusion can absolutely be argued for, whatever has happened in our history, is in our collective memories and the way that we remember. But again, it goes beyond that too, because there are these figures and histories. It's not simply about the way we remember, it's about their presence and their existence. And the more we can highlight them, the more we can make the case for how Chinese Americans, whether it's the railroad workers, individuals like Young, communities like the CEM, or all those other 100,000+ Chinese Americans in 1880, long before and long after, up to 2019, of course, are part of an American story, are part of the American story of American identity. And the more we can remember that, the more that this becomes not just about one history or one moment, like the Iron Road and the Transcontinental Railroad, but about how those are stages in an evolving history, a continual history, not just of Chinese Americans, but of all Americans as well. Thanks. So I'm not sure exactly what the official time is, but I'm happy to make it.
Sure. But before we do the Q&A, I just want to mention that if you're interested in learning more about the young men that came on the Chinese educational mission, we do have a book called Fortunate Sons. And if you're all interested in the Angel Island poetry, we also have a book on that too.
Nice. Libraries, good place for inclusive. Yes.
Don't worry about it.
I think his name is John, the one who founded.
Young Win, yep.
Yeah. Did he have a hard time marrying his wife then? Was there a lot of?
As far as I can tell, right. As far as I can tell, not directly. Partly because he was individually pretty famous. You know, even after the Exclusion era, he merits a New York Times obituary. He was a very prominent individual figure, and so I think in some ways, despite the real tragic sides of what happened, that allowed his experience to be more positive at times, let's say, than certainly, say, Chinese American railroad workers in that more anonymous or communal sense. I think that's important to say about Young. He was very individually famous and prominent, and again, a kind of a significant diplomatic figure, so certain protections. The New York Times article on their wedding, for example, there's an article of when they get married, and it's sort of kind of wryly remarking on the cultural kind of connection or the cross-cultural relationship, but also just celebrating in a really interesting way. Like it notes, not in that picture, but it notes in the Times piece that Mary Kellogg dressed for the wedding in part in Chinese apparel, in a Chinese wedding gown, whereas Young was clad, I forget how the Times puts it, but in a sort of Western suit, right? So noting kind of wryly, but also I think interestingly the cross-cultural side of their relationship, right? The way that they both were moving in this marriage in pretty interesting ways, that their sons then extended. So my sense of it is, well, after the Exclusion Act, they definitely were affected, that in some ways his life was more kind of individually fortunate at times than was the larger story of the yellow peril kind of narrative. That's my general sense, although I'm sure there's lots of nuances within that.
What got you involved in all this? What got you interested in the culture and the history?
Yeah, it's a good question. A lot. I think I would say two things really overtly. One of which is scholarly, and one is not, although just as important. The scholarly one is actually that baseball game. I heard about that a long time ago. I think briefly it's mentioned in a PBS documentary called, maybe it's just called The Chinese Americans, or The Chinese American Experience. It's from the 90s. It's a long-standing PBS documentary that I had encountered somewhere, and they talked very briefly about that baseball game. And I'm a lifelong baseball fan, and that just struck me as one of those stories that, it should already be a screenplay. It should already have been told many times. Luckily, it hasn't, for my sake, I guess. But it really should. So that was one thing, was that very particular moment that opens up then to a lot of these other stories and histories. And then the other, just for autobiographical full disclosure, my ex-wife is Chinese American. My sons look a lot like Morrison and Bartlett Young in a lot of ways, I would say. And so when I learned more about Young and his family and that story, it opened up to some very personal stuff for my own thinking about my own family, my own multi-generational story, and how my sons will think about all this. They've continued to evolve in the way that they think about their Chinese American heritage. Their grandparents, their mom's parents came to the U.S. after 1965, after that Immigration Act. But thinking about that, thinking about their identities, thinking about their relationship, my relationship to those multi-generational stories. So both this kind of historical detail and then some really personal stuff, I would say, is a part of what led me to a lot of this.
I thought that young guy was a hero in my eyes, when you were talking about him.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I just think, to make the contemporary connection for a second, I think part of what gets tricky sometimes is that this feeling that if we remember the darkest stuff in American history, it becomes this divisive thing, right? It becomes about just another way of thinking about us and them, right? Rather than the exclusionary way, it's a way of thinking about just villains and victims. And clearly that's part of the story. It has to be. We have to remember some of these darkest moments, the Chinatown Massacre, for example. But some of the best, most inspiring histories and figures I know come from remembering those things too. And Young is a great example. I think that's a part of the next project I want to work on, is just continuing to tell those stories, the stories of Young, of the mission, of the baseball game. Again, it doesn't get more sort of inspiringly American and all that to me. And that requires the worst, the darkest of that era, but we also get to all that stuff. We get to all that really good stuff too. I think that's something everybody can and should be affected by and engage with, so I agree. Other stuff?
What is it in our society and our government in many ways that prevents us from learning from the past? I mean, you look at the indigenous people in France. They had the Jewish people at the time of World War II, the Italians, the Chinese, the Japanese. What is it? Why do we have such a hard time letting people integrate into our society? Just a little question.
Yeah, no, just a moment. I think my answer of it has partly evolved too, and in a somewhat pessimistic way. Because the optimistic thing I used to say, and I still believe this in part, was that we just don't. These haven't been part of our collective memories, these histories, right? They just haven't. They're not in schools, they're not in textbooks, they're not, to this day, as good as we've gotten comparatively when it comes to sort of, say, multicultural social studies education, I still, when my students at Fitchburg State, very, very few have even heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Have even heard of it when they come to college, much less have any sort of actual engagement with it. So it's still not consistently sort of taught, remembered, present. And so that is still part of it, I think, is that we just genuinely don't collectively remember well. That's continued work that needs to happen. But I guess the other thing that I would say, and I say it more in 2019 than I would have said it 5 years ago even, is the exclusionary narrative, at least in part, is a overtly white supremacist vision of America, right? Is a vision of America that is in us, that is particular. And that is particularly, looks like me, although my mom's family are Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe, so not really me, but looks like me. Is white European American as that definition. I think that definition is more present and powerful today than I thought it was. And so I think it has always been, I suppose. And I think that is still in force. And so while I still optimistically believe a lot of us collectively, if we better remember can think about America differently. I also would argue that there's a significant number of my fellow Americans who don't want to, who want to think about America fundamentally as a white European place. And I don't exactly know how to have that conversation, because my argument is it has never been, right? Not just that it isn't, it has never been that. That's been a part of it, but it has never been defined by that. There's no moment you can look to that isn't defined equally by indigenous peoples, African American peoples, the Filipino communities that are present in Louisiana in the 1750s, long before it's part of the U.S. Again, and on and on and on and on. There's no American moment you can look at that doesn't have all those communities and cultures too. And so that's a gap that's hard to bridge, because it's not just about collective memory, right? It's about that vision of an America that is one particular cultural identity, rather than what I would argue for, the presence of all these cultures and communities that then define this place and connect to it.
Well, even religions work into it.
Sure,
also.
absolutely religions work into
Protestant, Muslim,
Absolutely.
Buddhist, whatever.
Yeah, all of it. All of it.
I'd like to see a big, a real melting pot, and I'd like this, the whole thing with getting rid of NAFTA and trade agreements and all that sort of stuff. That really bothers me also, because the way I see it, the more every country depends on every other country, the better off we are. Because it makes a web of common interests.
And I agree with that, and there's a global side to this and a universal side. But then the other thing that I come back to, because I do, part of what I always try to think about is how to frame these, to partly challenge what I just said, how to frame these as best as possible for as many American audiences as possible, right? That's a big part of my goal, just in my own work. And so, for example, I do think, while there are a lot of countries that have somewhat similar stories, that some of that truly multicultural stuff in American history is exceptional, is part of what defines us as really different from a lot of other places, right? If you look at a lot of nations, they do have maybe a more homogeneous kind of era, and then they gradually evolve. And that's fine, that's their story. The American story to me that makes us so exceptional is the opposite, that we as this particular place have always been so multi everything, cultural, national, religion, language, everything. And that's part of what makes us so exceptional to me, is precisely that. So as much as there's a global side that I totally agree with too, I also think there is something just really definingly American about that combination, right? That makes Young's story, like again, not just sort of like an add-on to an American story, just as defining an American story as you can get, right? Like that is as American as I can imagine. His story, the CEM, the game, like those are fundamental American stories because of that exceptionally multi-everything identity that we've always had. So that's part of what I want to argue for too. And again, I think we can do it in a way that isn't then threatening, that isn't about taking something away as much as seeing what has always been who we are, right? And that features European Americans as much as everybody else, right? That features everybody in that. So I guess that's the optimistic thing of what I was just saying more pessimistically, is there is a vision of America that is profoundly different from that. But I think there's a way to make the case for America that is profoundly different from the exclusionary vision, that isn't then just about, sort of completely threatening, even threatening, say, American patriotism, right? That's why I try to argue for critical patriotism, for kind of highlighting and celebrating these parts of America, right? Because it's not just about saying, sort of doing away with a celebration of America, of who we are. It's arguing for this vision of who we've really always been, even just as a sort of exceptional individual nation. That's part of what my goal is with a lot of this too.
Was it unusual for a place like Yale to be that open? That surprised me.
Yeah, I think the missionary connection was part of it. I think it was still at least somewhat theological at the time. It wasn't completely anymore. But like Harvard, it was founded entirely as a sort of divinity school, as a theological enterprise. And I think that legacy meant that Young had this. If he had just sort of applied as say the son of railroad workers or something, no, I don't think Young in 1850 lets him in. But he had that missionary connection. He had that connection to a Christian community. Although again, he overtly kind of makes his own way once he's there and to go.
After that, there must have been more than a single student.
Eventually, I think he's the only one for a bit. There are other individual examples of folks, Dartmouth famously with Native American presences in that era too, and much earlier. But I think he was a pioneer, but yes, it gradually becomes, and certainly the CEM students 2 decades later, all attend colleges, or almost all attend colleges and universities, including Yale and many others. One of them, I think it was this guy, Juan Vinchon, goes to Worcester Polytechnic, WPI, was called something different. back then, but he's the only one to attend a public, the university was public at the time. So they attend a number. So by that era, by the 1870s, it becomes much more of a possibility that Young had partly pioneered, I think.
You know about quotas later on, so I just wanted to see.
No, it's a really important sort of stage along that educational inclusion as well.
I'm curious if you see linkages between, since you brought up the subject of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism and the exclusion.
Yeah, I mean, again, yes, there's these two fundamentally different ways of thinking about us, right? And so I grant that let's say the European-focused, the sort of white Christian European-focused narrative of America, that's not just about like racism or exclusion. It also, for example, is about celebrating the Puritans, right, as a kind of founding American community, something that we are very wedded to in a lot of ways up in Mass, right? I grew up in Virginia celebrating Jamestown and the heritage of the English there, right? While those communities were in various ways complicated and problematic, they were originating parts of that early American landscape and community, right? And so if you start there, even in ways that aren't just overtly, let's say, about racial exclusion or segregation or the like, it then can lead to this vision of a kind of more homogeneous kind of starting point, right? That America was founded in one way or another as English, for example, right? And of course, in various ways, that then could be argued for, the founding era and documents, right? They're written in English, they're drafted by this particular group of men who are either descended from English colonies or new English arrivals. And so again, leaving aside race and racism, I grant that there is a sort of thread for arguing for an America that is more defined at these various stages by European American community and identity, right? And if you make that case, it is a different exceptional vision of America that does make it more possible, let's say, to still argue for communities that are not part of that defining community, as at the very least changes, right? New additions, changes to that defining originating identity. Again, I personally would dispute that, and I would say instead those communities are part of the founding. And yet at the same moments there are all these other communities too, right? Whether it's indigenous people or African American slaves or the Moroccan Muslim community in South Carolina during the American Revolution or all these other communities that I would make the case for. And so that's the way that I would respond to that. But I fully understand that there is this other kind of exceptional idea of America that is one that starts, let's say, with the Puritans and then goes up through, Ben Franklin up to the Founding Fathers and then on down. And that vision, which is not just, again, about race or white supremacy, although it's hard to completely separate, is a very different definition of a kind of exceptional America, right? And that can lead to exclusion, not just in racist terms, but in the sense of these communities are not part of that founding identity, right? They're not part of that starting point. And so at the very least, in that vision, they're a change, there's something different. So yes, I think that is possible. I think that is part of the mix. Again, there's ways that I would respond to that and push back on that. But I do see it, and I guess the other thing I'll say about that is a complicated point too, but it's why I don't like, say the idea just of the most critical, the most negative vision of those sides of American identity, right? Like the America was never great, that argument, right? I understand where that's coming from, but what that does is it completely sort of does away with those presences, right? It just says the Puritans were religious bigots and hypocrites who persecuted Native Americans. That all happened, but if that's the only way we define them, I think A, it's not accurate to other things that were part of their community too, and B, it makes it much harder to bridge that gap then, right? Because then you've either got someone arguing for the Puritans as who we were at the beginning, or someone saying they are just an example of some of the ugliest, most divisive side. And how do you ever bridge those two things? So if you can say, no, they were one founding American community, but so were the Wampanoag, right? And what does it mean to look at the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag and say they're both founding American communities? Unfortunately, at war a lot of the time in that early era, but they were both there, and they both continue to be there. They're both there today. What do we do with that, right? So just that idea of kind of pushing in between, let's say, just the homogenous kind of English narrative that I don't subscribe to, or one that just says, that's just the worst, those are just the villains. But saying sort of, no, they're part of it, and then there's all these other parts too. And how do we make the case for that? That's my multi-part complicated answer to that.
So first I would like to say another thank you for coming
Sure.
to do this for us tonight. This is great. I have a question when the people were encouraging the young Chinese American men to further their educations, was there conversation, you think, among them about the young Chinese American women?
It's a great question. And it does, I mean, the start of the school precedes the Page Act, so it's not that it would have been impossible. After 1875, it would have been much more difficult for Chinese women to come because of that incredibly restrictive way that the Page Act defined that entire gender, the entire community. But prior to that, it certainly would have been, and that is, I think, in part a limit of Young's. He was thinking definitely in a patriarchal kind of way, thinking about sort of this next generation of young Chinese men, and of again being able to have an experience not unlike his as a Chinese American man too. And so in his own writing about it, and in the kind of back and forth of the founding of the school, I haven't seen much engagement with Chinese American women who were, as the Page Act reflected, certainly a significant part of the evolving community, say in the West, for sure, of that multi-generational community. So no, unfortunately, I think in that particular school, it's definitely a limit. It was framed very fully as a male enterprise, a kind of patriarchal. As of course, up to that point in America, college had mostly been, right? That's the first era of the real development of women's colleges and of the possibility of higher ed for young American women, and certainly that has started by then, so it definitely would have been a possibility, but I don't think it was quite where he or they were, unfortunately, and a limit of that moment for sure.
So how did the Exclusion Act carry into the 20th century? So sort of like narrow that down, like the emergence of like Chinese restaurants. It's like, like, was there like a significant like wearing down of it over time that people just didn't enforce it, or was there?
Yeah. I mean, the way that I would put it, I guess, is more about resistance and survival. I think it certainly remained present and in some significant force, and all those Angel Island detainees reflect that, right? Many tens of thousands of people were detained at Angel Island over those decades. Some did eventually make it to the US, for sure, so it wasn't always sort of enforced at its most full-on, successful, full exclusion version, again, and not only in the Paper Sons way. People had legal allies, they had family allies, they had various ways of continuing to evolve as a community, and then the existing community didn't really, I think, shrink exactly. If you look at the censuses, it didn't grow like it would have without exclusion, but that 102,000 in 1880 didn't go away either. That number never went significantly down, it just didn't go up as much as it likely would have. So the community endured, it survived, individuals continued to find a way to come, the individuals who were here certainly continued to evolve. Places like Boston and New York's Chinatown didn't go anywhere, and certainly continued to feature those restaurants and businesses, and so I think that's the way I would frame it, is as a story of survival and resistance and persistence, despite those laws and their effects, which definitely were significant, but not effective at destroying, right? Effective at limiting, effective at keeping that diversity from developing in the way that it probably could have, but not effective at fundamentally in any way uprooting that community. And in fact, again, it survived and persisted, and all those legacies of neighborhoods, of restaurants, of communities, of associations like the CCBA, which was in full force in 1898, again, long after the Exclusion Act, all those things reflect that persistence and that survival. So that's the way that I would frame it, and there are lots of there's a really great book, I can't remember the author now, about the history of Chinese restaurants in those neighborhoods that came out a couple, is that Erica Lee, maybe? Can't remember who.
Yeah, I think I read it.
Yeah, recent, pretty prominent book about the history of Chinese food in America, basically, that is an example of that persistence and survival, again, in the face of these kinds of laws. So that's definitely a big part of the story, and I think that's reflected in those kind of institutions, too.
I've noticed that in this day and age, we see one of the big complaints is that these immigration quotas have been really changed. That has to be a thread that's gone through with this too, because if you limit the number of people, then certainly that's another way of excluding them.
Sure, and I mean, again, outside of just the context of this talk, when immigration law develops in full in the U.S. in 1921 and 24 with the Quota Acts, that's what it does. Right, and as I argue in my Chinese Exclusion Act book, which is one of the ones I have an e-copy of, if people are interested to send them, those 20s Quota Acts just take the idea of exclusion and apply it to many more communities, many more nationalities. So that's what quotas always were, basically, was an extension of not just exclusion, but of the hierarchy behind it, right? So in the 1924 Quota Act, or the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, the average number of English arrivals allowed under that law was 55,000. Again, Asian nations were entirely excluded. Greece to name an example of a nation that was defined as not desirable, was 100. That was the equivalent. Which is an exclusion act by another name, right? That's like one ship, I guess, maybe not. And again, how that was or wasn't enforced, whole other complicated story. But the language of it, the idea of it, was just a broader kind of exclusion. That's what 24 was about. And then that begins to shift in 65 with the 1965 Immigration Act, which does away with quotas based on nationality, right? Which is still technically enforced. That's why things like a Muslim ban are overtly not possible under the current law, because after 65 it's not legally possible to delineate exclusion or inclusion based on either nationality, ethnicity, or religion. But I think it's also worth saying, way beyond the context of this one talk, immigration laws continue to be about defining more and less desirable categories. And that's still a conversation we're not quite having in full, right? So after 65, for example, certain educational levels are privileged. Maybe they should be, but we need to talk about how that, I mean, that's not radically different, it's just different in degree, or it's a different emphasis, right? It's not saying this country is less desirable than this other country, it's saying a certain level of education is less desirable than another level, which makes it impossible still in 2019 for individuals in many places around the world to come legally to the US, right? They have no choice about whether they can come legally or not, because their situation makes it impossible for them to come under this set. And again, that may be what we want, but it's a conversation we need to have more fully, right? So even just the idea of excluding particular communities hasn't exactly gone away, it's just changed in terms of how those communities are defined, and who is more or less possible, or possible at all, to come to the United States under our laws. That has evolved a lot since the 20s, but it's still the case. It's still the way that our laws work. And again, maybe it should be, that's a conversation we could have, but it's a conversation we still aren't quite having, right? There still is this idea, I think, and it goes back to the 20s as well, that every individual has a choice for how they come. And that's never been the case. Not at any point in our immigration law, it's still not the case. It's that communities are defined in different ways, and then those communities can or can't legally be part of the United States. That still remains the way our law works, it just applies differently to different individuals. Yeah, that's a much bigger conversation than just these couple of minutes. We're putting up all sorts of cans of worms. Yeah.
I found it really kind of curious that you started out with Harlan,
Mm-hmm.
and he had two quotes about how how Chinese Americans are so different that they cannot become part of us.
Right.
And I was thinking about how in our whole history, as I understand it, we have said that about many, many people. Catholics, certainly, Italians, I'm Italian. Right now, Muslims.
Sure.
And I think it's so interesting how all of these groups of people who could not be American because their culture was so foreign, all of us have become American. I mean, you know, and when I think of American exceptionalism, and I know there are all kinds of theories about what that means and all that stuff, but I always thought what made us so unusual was that we are a country with people from all over the world. And somehow we all come here and, you know, in my view, we have a lot of what I would call subcultures. You know, I'm Italian, and my family is like very Italian. And I've spent my whole life trying to get away from all that.
It's another part of the story too.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, a lot of us are like that. You know, traditional families, or, I don't know, I have a friend who grew up on a commune in California, you know, and it's like, so anyway, I think about us as a country, as a place where you come here and you get to be who you are. You know, you know, you have to earn a livelihood and you have to obey most laws, but, you know, you get to live your life, and in lots of places in the world you can't do that.
You know, that's another way of thinking about that exceptionalism. And I mean, the example I would point to, just to further your point one more time, and again, people have heard me in other contexts, a lot of people in here talk about this, but the really great one for me is Ben Franklin, who I like a lot in a lot of ways. He was a cool dude. But in 1755, pretty early in his life, he writes this book called like Observations on 72 different things. And there's this part of it where he's really worried about Pennsylvania being taken over by Germans, that the Germans are coming to Pennsylvania and they're trying to Germanize us, they're trying to make us speak German rather than being anglicized by us. And he says that in every way, including their complexion, they are just too different from us. And I mean, I don't know, like, if that's not an example of that way of thinking, like, there's nothing about the German complexion that's any different from Ben Franklin, but it's that way of thinking, right? There's this group, and they're just not us. And then not 20 years later, Germans were just a central part of that revolutionary. And Franklin, to his credit, evolved in his thinking and recognized that too. But absolutely, that threat of, wait, that's the other. That's that threat to me. That's that threat to however I want to define this us. For him, it was Pennsylvania at the time, Anglo-Pennsylvania. It's continually present and continually wrong. It's wrong every time. But continually present, again, we don't certainly seem to be able to just remember that and say, wait a second, Franklin was wrong about the Germans, and they were wrong about the French in the 1780s, and they were wrong about the Irish, and they were wrong, but then why, how could it possibly not be a pattern, right? And then to push back further, as you're saying, it's not simply a matter then of just saying, okay, so all these groups are part. But the next step that we also have to get better at is defining what that we is then. That isn't just about a bunch of people, right? Because that can't just be it ultimately. I think people do need a sense of things that are shared. And maybe that shared aspect is just the idea of coming to a place, of being part of a place, and then of making a way within that place. Maybe that is a part of what we can define. But whatever it is, I do agree that that's a next step too, right? It can't just be a matter of inclusion being everybody here, although that's part of what I want to argue for. We do then need to keep thinking about, okay, what can be shared? What can be part of that that can be argued for and sort of made part of that case? And I think that sometimes is lacking as well in some of the arguments about just the collection of communities that I certainly share, is that goal of then thinking about what we can see as a shared part of it. Because I think that is an important part of the story and the conversation too.
I don't know if you saw it, but somehow or another it circulated on my Facebook page, and I guess it was one of your friends had given it out. And it was a picture of 3 different colored eggs, and then later it shows all of the yolks and they're all the same. It's just a great picture, a great depiction of how we look at things. We only look at it from the outside, not from the inside.
Well, and I do think that part of what makes this tricky is that there are things that are specific to the different cultures and communities that are part of America that we don't want to lose, right? Because it's part of what makes that combination so great too, right? So that, Young to the end of his life absolutely had strong connections to China and Chinese heritage and identity, right? It wasn't, the melting pot where just he sort of lost everything that was distinguishing in favor of something else. It was the addition, right? The combination. And then obviously the next generation is a different version of that, and Morrison and Bartlett's sons or daughters would be a next generation of that, and so on. But also, that combination, again, of the different cultures and communities who do bring different things, and that does make us this multi-part nation, and then seeing the shared sides too, right? Maybe particularly the idea of sort of multi-generational identity is part of what's shared. I think that's all part of that.